Welcome to Helping Organisations Thrive. Today I have the great pleasure of Dr. Susan Kahn. Good morning to you, Susan.
Good morning. Nice to see you, Julian.
Good to see you too. You are a business psychologist, consultant, coach, and mediator, and also the author of the book Bounce Back: How to Fail Fast and Be Resilient at Work. And today we're going to be exploring the unconscious selves at work and looking at beneath the surface of us and looking at those sort of defense mechanisms that perhaps we bring to work. But before we get into that conversation, Susan, I'd like to ask you, what do you love about what you do?
Oh, it's such a nice question to be asked. I think that the thing that I love best is just getting the inside story with my clients, with organizations, being able to create a space that's safe enough for people to talk about what really matters to them. And I think that kind of privilege of being able to listen deeply to somebody is one that I never take for granted. It's a wonderful way to create connections with all kinds of different people that I might not have an opportunity to encounter if I wasn't doing this sort of work.
There's a lot of curiosity in that, isn't there? Being curious about people and interested in people, and it's interesting. I think it's a lost art, that curiosity. We had it as a
Yeah.
child, but now it seems to be lost, doesn't it?
Yeah, and the fact that we're always sort of surprised, we might have an impression of how things are going to be, and then you go in with sort of Beyonce said, without curiosity, without expectation, and then sometimes what we discover is really an absolute kind of opposite of what we might have expected. So leaving those kind of expectations behind is always a good start.
And I hope. Well, I'm curious this morning because we're talking about this sort of unconscious self, and I'd like you to, I guess, define the unconscious self and why it's important to explore it in the context of work.
Well, because we have, Sigmund Freud to thank for bringing the unconscious to life for many of us. The idea that with a sort of typical iceberg representation, we only usually reveal to the world a fragment of who we are. There's so much buried below the surface that might be our sort of our pain, our trauma, our motivation, the reasons we have emerged as we emerge. And it matters because when you're working with leaders, when you're working with teams, you need to be able to understand in the workplace what the whole person is, what they're bringing to their decision making, to the way they lead, to the way they manage, and often it's as much about helping the individual understand what might be going on in their unconscious as it is understanding what might be going on below the surface in organizations. So what's presented is often not necessarily what's going on.
And how can we know what's showing up, what's presenting is our unconscious self? How do we know that? How can we sort of detect that? What are the sort of things that we can do to sort of know that?
Right, it's not straightforward because we spend a lot of our lives protecting ourselves from pain and from anxiety. And so the unconscious is the place where we bury those things that are quite difficult for us to confront. So to actually bring the things that are in the unconscious to the fore, we need to work pretty hard. We need to pay attention to patterns of behavior, to perhaps question some of the decisions we make, perhaps to think about our dreams and the slips of the tongue and the things that people say to us that maybe hurt us the most, to question what might really be happening. So it's something as an observer in an organization, one can have an insight into in a way that you can't necessarily when you're in the midst of everything that's happening. So you might, for example, go into an organization and you might hear words such as, we really care for our organization. We really care for our people. We don't want them to work too hard. We want them to have a very balanced life. We want them to be able to spend time with their family. So that's the narrative. And yet the reality might be that there's a working culture of 7 to 10 p.m. and that, people are too scared to talk about hospital appointments or going to a kid's sports day or plaything, because what's said and what's actually acted out is quite different. And there, within an organizational context, it might be that what really matters is absolute commitment to the organization and less of a commitment to what matters to the individual.
So how do we take that disconnect that you've just said there, where you have that one saying one thing and doing another?
Yeah.
How do we create I suppose, a culture or an environment where we can happily explore our unconscious selves? Because we're going to talk a bit more about why that's really beneficial, but how
Yeah.
can we sort of create that?
Well, it takes quite a lot of courage. I mean, we've said sort of curiosity is something that's important, and an individual and organization needs to be able to consider what else might be going on. The idea that the emotions that we experience are not just about us, but are also connected to what else might be going on in the system, in the way an organization works. So paying attention, having the sort of psychological safety where you can sort of question this dissonance between what's said and what's done, being able to say, that you feel unable to speak up, perhaps, or that you disagree with an action that's been taken, those sort of opportunities to question what's going on. But really, to bring the unconscious to the fore, you need to be able to take a long, hard look at what's going on and be able to consider that everything isn't absolutely black and white, that there is this nuance, that there are these motivations and desires and difficulties that exist there as well, and that is all part of what makes up the organization, not just the glossy bit that you present to clients and to the fore.
So it really matters, isn't it, knowing our unconscious self, isn't it, and sort of going a bit deeper and say going below the iceberg, sort of
Yeah.
analogy. And so, well, firstly, what ways can we do that? What are sort of pragmatic ways or practical ways that can help us unlock that? And how does that help us become better leaders? I mean, it sounds really obvious, knowing ourselves, but how does that really make us better as a leader in terms of how we interact with people and how we lead people and how we cast vision and everything else?
I think I would just like to say that it is really difficult to tap into the unconscious. The reason why it's unconscious is because it's protecting us. It's below the surface because it's been buried there because of, as we've said, anxiety or trauma. So you need to first of all attend to it, to look at your patterns of behavior. So let me give you an example of a leader who perhaps feels that they are a very good listener and a very entertaining and supportive individual. And that's their self-definition. And yet everybody around them is terrified of this individual. They're scared of what might come out of their mouth. They feel they have to laugh at their jokes because they're, in a prominent position of power. And this leader is, going through their working life, feeling that they're, doing everything just right, that they are, fulfilling every kind of expectation as a leader. But in order to change, that leader needs to perhaps stop talking and really listen to the people around them, to actually have the courage to say, I like to think of myself as a good communicator. How do you experience me? And to make it possible for people to speak up without being reprimanded or penalized or, given some kind of negative kind of treatment. And that is something that, even as I'm describing it to you, there's a sense of it's quite difficult to do. So, I mean, we
Mm.
both work as coaches to actually create the safety where we can take a look at ourselves and say, yeah, I do that. I don't necessarily like the fact that I do that, but let's see if I can think about how I might be able to change it. So one way is to reflect, to become more self-aware, not just through your own internal interrogation, but also asking those around you. I don't think you should ask everybody, because there's all kinds of emotions around, envy and, destruction, and sort of a wish to see people kind of crumble. But to be able to listen without judgment, as much as possible, can help you then to become a better leader.
I mean, that example where you've got that leader thinking that they are a great listener and entertaining, and yet they're not, and people
Yeah.
are frightened them. I mean, that's a massive dissonance in terms of that.
Mm.
Why do you think we get? I mean, obviously that goes down to self-awareness and knowing how we impact other people. When we walk into a room, how people react when we say things, how people respond to our presence, I guess. Why do people get? Obviously, what's the blocker that people have that such difference in their own opinion of who they are, or who they like to be, versus who they are when they interact with people? What do you think gets in
Mm.
the way of that?
Mm. It's such a complex area. We're all the product of our first groups, our families, our first experiences, our own kind of particular ways of experiencing the world. And you and I talking together might have a sense of who we are, but we may overlook the fact that because of our age or our ethnicity or the way we speak or the way we're dressed or our education or the language we use, we are creating an image that might be at odds with how we see ourselves. So there's this work to be done, not just in understanding ourselves, but recognizing that the self we present to the world is not necessarily going to be received in the way we might imagine. So when I work with different age groups, there's a very different response to who I am than when I'm working with somebody who is perhaps sort of relatable to me in terms of age. Teenagers, for example, have got a very different understanding and experience of somebody who's relating to someone of my generation than they would of somebody who is, uh, cooler, younger, with a different language, with a different way of presenting. So we don't see ourselves as others see us, and that can be helpful sometimes, but it is good for us to be aware that it's not a universal given that we are received as we imagine we are.
And do you think there's when we realize who we are in terms of our self-awareness and where we're at, do you think that can have a negative impact on us in terms of the reality that is before that projection of what we'd like to be, a sense of this is my future self in terms of my development, where I'd like to go to is that desire. If we get too aware of we're right here, does that tend to sort of diminish our motivation and our sense to grow, and perhaps make us feel a bit lacking in self-confidence, self-belief?
Hmm. Yeah, of course, it can feel quite sort of diminishing if we imagine ourselves to be, for example, particularly informed about the way we sort of uh, go about our work, be that in terms of communicating or in terms of, identifying sort of core issues going on. It can be difficult, but I think that sort of sense of being both somebody who has power and strength and capacity to make a difference, but also knowing that we're really insignificant, that actually we really don't matter that much. That's something quite good to hold on both sides. But we will be, for some people, you can't get away from the fact that I am a white, cisgendered, middle-aged woman who speaks a certain way, who acts a certain way. So by the very nature of who I am, I will have an easy access into some groups and a more challenging access into others. Assumptions will be made about me because of who I am. And I think that being aware of that is good. It doesn't necessarily mean that you change that reality. But I think just being aware of that is a really helpful thing to acknowledge.
And so we mentioned before about sort of defense mechanisms and how that can really come into the workplace. And I guess this stems out of this protecting our unconscious selves. And just tell me a bit more about that and how that might play out in the context of work.
Yeah, I think defense mechanisms are a really interesting area, and we are all subject to engaging with the different defense mechanisms at multiple times during the day. So it's not something you become aware of and then you stop, occupying. So defense mechanisms were, first identified by Freud. The most prominent one is, repression, the idea that we push away those things that are too painful to deal with, that we hide them. And they were picked up in a sort of very similar way, but in a more expansive way, by his daughter, Anna Freud, who wrote The Ego and Mechanisms of Defense. And she identified different ways in which we operate in order to protect ourselves. So it might be repression, it might be denial, it might be intellectualization, it might be sublimation, and I can tell you a bit more about those different defense mechanisms. But essentially, we all have a toolkit of things we use to protect ourselves, and they prove to be a very good service to our sense of safety and well-being. But it can be destructive at work. So let me give you an example of perhaps denial. So that's one of the defense mechanisms where we simply don't face up to a truth. So if we are engaging in a particular career path where we want to progress to another kind of level, and we're constantly being pushed back, it's constantly not happening. Rather than thinking, maybe I should take another direction, maybe this isn't right for my particular skill set. Instead, we say something like, oh, they didn't like me, they didn't want a person like me, or maybe I didn't want that job actually, or perhaps there was something else going on. There's a kind of a failure to engage in the reality and the truth. So that can be very limiting, that sort of operation of denial. But perhaps something which is also very recognizable is this idea of displacement. I don't know whether you're familiar with this notion that we may have a really bad day at work. A client's really difficult. Our colleagues are unsupportive. Something we've worked really hard on hasn't come to fruition, and we take it really well at work. We occupy a very sort of calm sense of acceptance. We're very professional. We acknowledge that we're maybe a little bit disappointed, but we accept it. We put the key in the door at home, we walk in, and we burst into an angry outburst at the
Kick the
dog,
cat on the way in.
or the cat, or whatever's gone on. That's where, and that is sort of where we can't process the emotion in the workplace, and so we take it out in our home environment, and that
Is that good? Is that a safety thing in terms of we're feeling safe and we can't do that at work? And so, if you had a workplace that was incredibly psychologically safe, would you feel you could do it there and sort of rant a bit and shout a bit, and which is okay to have that emotion
Yeah.
rather than taking it home? Do you think that would create a better environment for that?
Possibly, possibly, but it depends how ingrained that particular defense mechanism is in us. Because if we are attached very much to this idea of presenting a perfect self at work, then even if we're in an environment that is psychologically safe, it might still take a lot of work to get us to actually admit that we've failed or we've done something wrong. You know, it's a tough kind of challenge. But you know, one of the useful ways in which we can become aware of things like that is, you know, if you could imagine a sort of social environment where perhaps partners come together with work colleagues, and somebody might be saying, oh, you know, I'm just very lucky, I just don't get stressed, you know, I just and the work colleagues are saying, yeah, no, it's really interesting, they're really calm at work. And then the partner says, calm, are you kidding, are you kidding, I always know when there's been a bad day at work, you know. So it's sort of, these things pop up, you know, we reveal where these sort of struggles are, either with you know, our dream life, you know, when we dream about things, you know, that's where the sort of unconscious comes to the surface, or perhaps, you know, with a slip of the tongue or a sort of bad joke, and it emerges, it emerges. And the more we become aware, the greater possibility it is that we can address those things.
I was going to ask, if it's a defense mechanism, what is wrong with that?
Yeah, yeah.
And that's okay, obviously protecting ourselves, but but so what is wrong with it, and why should we deal
Mm.
with that? Why should we get more aware of this and try to deal with it, and how can we deal with it?
Mm. Yeah, I mean, it's a really good point. You know, defense mechanisms are very important for us all. They serve a purpose. But perhaps an example to share is the idea of a defense mechanism almost like an armor. And, you know, when we're wearing armor, it without doubt protects us. It means that we're not going to get stabbed or shot or, you know, mortally injured. Yet, if we wear our armor all the time, it does get really, really heavy. It's very hard to be nimble. It's very hard to be agile. It's very hard to, you know, touch and embrace. So a defense mechanism does serve a useful purpose. The defense mechanism that's often sort of highlighted as the kind of good one to have is sublimation, where we turn our pain and our suffering into something that's creative and effective. So you might think of a poet or an artist or somebody who uses their experiences of trauma to share creatively with the world. So in that way, it's a very healthy way to process the anguish that you've had in your life. And you know, then it's, as you say, it's not a bad thing. It's something we're all engaged in constantly. So it's not a negative, but I think where it interferes with relationships, where it means we don't take up opportunities, where we, for example, unable to face failure because we're too afraid of the fact that that will mean we're not good enough, that we're a sort of a less than individual. On those occasions, it's worth looking at those defense mechanisms and thinking, right, do I always rationalize or intellectualize things because it's easier for me to bear that than to actually face the possibility that I wasn't liked, or my idea wasn't as good as someone else's, or they didn't want me. You know, that's you know, that takes, you know, some courage to say, you know, they didn't want me, but it's okay. You know, others might.
And so people might be listening to it right now, and already things are popping into their heads, their own defense
Mm,
mechanisms. I think, oh yeah, I do that. I do a bit
mm,
of denial. I do a bit of displacement.
mm.
How can we is there a process, or is it through a coach, or how can we ourselves
Mm,
identify those defense mechanisms, and then how do we, I suppose, stop doing them if they're causing us damage, carrying this
mm,
arm around, and make it more effective as individuals?
mm. Well, I think, having a safe space to process these patterns of behavior is useful, whether that's in therapy, whether that's with a coach, or indeed, if you don't have access to that kind of resource, journaling and recording what's going on, perhaps finding, a way to actually attend to and notice what's happening.
Mm,
That's always very useful. And there will be times when you become more aware of a particular pattern than others. Perhaps you might be in a vulnerable state because of bereavement or your mental health, or because you're working in an environment where your job is not secure, or you perhaps have got relationship difficulties. So there are moments where it becomes more prominent. But there's nothing that beats just taking time to consider yourself, consider the data that surrounds you, what you said, how you're experienced, what things you tend
mm.
to do at times of crisis. And of course, having someone to talk that through, who you trust and you feel safe with, is of course a wonderful asset.
And if say, I mean, I know for myself, and I've noticed over the years, and certainly been a coach, becoming more aware and attuned to myself. I had that sort of displacement where you sort of have a bad day conversation, and I've almost been halfway through that defense mechanism of sort of onto somebody else, and I've realized, and I've almost then just physically stopped myself to do it,
Oh,
and then
yeah.
and I've identified, oh, okay, I'm just sharing, and then I've turned it around and I've shared, actually, I'm feeling a bit rubbish about this, and rather than putting it on them, I share it, as in, because it's good to share, obviously. So how can, what tips have you found with your clients, with yourself even, to how to sort of not only notice it when you obviously that, and then, but actually, how do I stop it? How do I change it? This sort of almost like a habit, really, of who I've been for many years.
Hmm. There's a lovely example you gave of that kind of stall that you do, that say, hang on, I can see what I'm about to do. But instead, what I'm going to do is say, I'm struggling with this, or I've had a bad day, or this has happened, and so I'm feeling a bit sensitive. As far as my personal experiences, I'm a retired perfectionist. I used to think that I had to get everything right, that every conversation had to be, enlightening, and that the other person had to think that I was the most sparkling person in the room, which is absolutely exhausting. And that comes from a sort of a sort of a defense mechanism, which is almost kind of turning in on yourself. You're not good enough. In order to be loved, you have to be perfect. So I think that recognizing that has been, firstly, deeply liberating for me, and probably, much less exhausting for my conversational partners who are having this sort of barrage of attention from me. But at work and in coaching relationships and working with teams, it's about bringing to the fore those things that we're doing and being able to identify it. So, when I work with groups as opposed to individuals, it's about asking the questions, how do you in this organization deal with people who make a mistake? How do you deal with things when they go wrong? And then hearing from participants about what's effective for them, but also allowing individuals to hear from each other about
Mm.
what they find difficult about the way one or other of them behaves. And that's always a challenge.
Yeah, and they say doing that sort of team environment, actually hearing other people's perspective is quite, well, not just enlightening, but it's powerful, because then people
Mm,
don't understand where people are coming from, realize why they do and might do things, or have a thinking on something that's very different to yours. This is a fascinating conversation, Susan, in terms of understanding a bit more of our unconscious, but also those defense mechanisms, which I think we all play into, and I think it's key to identify those, and obviously then look at ways of changing them, and sort of being just the awareness things helps massively. If people want to sort of connect with you and get in touch with you, what's the best way of doing that?
Well, I'd be delighted to hear from people if they want to connect on LinkedIn, or if they want to follow me on Instagram at Dr. Susan Kahn. And I do share material and thoughts around this position of taking a more holistic view of an organization and the individuals that hope to thrive within those institutions.
Thanks for your time today, Susan. Really
Okay.
appreciate it.
Lovely to talk to you.